take it away.
Hopefully you can see my slide.
Yes.
Great. Okay, so thanks for the introduction, Amanda. I'm going to be talking about regeneration issues in the Northeast, as she said, and I work for the Inventory and Monitoring Program with the National Park Service, and I've already kind of gotten the introduction of what I do. So I lead the forest health monitoring for 3 networks, the Northeast Temperate Network, Northeast Coastal and Barrier, and the Mid-Atlantic networks for the INM program, and that's 20 parks from Maine to Virginia. Our protocol was largely adapted from the Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis program. So climate change is a big issue in parks, a big concern. It really forces us to look outside of our boundaries and have a broader regional view to plan and adapt management goals with climate change in mind. And species distribution models like the Climate Change Tree Atlas are really helpful for this. So species distribution models, for those unfamiliar, they take environmental and climate variables that best predict the current distribution of a species, and then they predict the future suitable habitat for that species using general circulation models of future climate scenarios. And so as you can see in the maps here, the Climate Change Tree Atlas predicts a major expansion of suitable habitat for oak hickory species into the northeastern US by the turn of the century. And even though everyone involved with the Climate Change Tree Atlas is really clear about how to interpret these maps correctly, which are merely predictions of future suitable habitat, not predictions of the future forest composition. I've heard a number of researchers and managers misinterpret these maps as predictions of what the forest will be in the next 50 to 100 years. Interpreting the maps this way, even though it's wrong, isn't really that alarming when you think about it. So the managers I work with generally are okay with the idea of northern hardwoods converting to oak hickory. And so the research I'm going to talk about was largely in response to this. I really wanted to see how likely tree species were going to be able to migrate into newly suitable habitat. And so thinking about tree migration is important. Eastern tree species largely migrated with their suitable habitat in response to past climate change, like post-glacial migration, rather than adapting to changes in place. And so whether they will be able to keep pace with current and future climate change now will depend on, among other things, dispersal, landscape configuration, life history traits, and tree regeneration. And so the first study I'm going to talk about is going to be related to related to dispersal, life history, and habitat connectivity, and then I'll talk about our regional regeneration study. So for our tree dispersal simulations, we simulated 100 years of dispersal for 15 eastern tree species that are predicted to gain suitable habitat in the Northeast. So this is to look at species-specific dispersal, and then also determine the influence of non-forest land use, identify major dispersal barriers, and then also compare dispersal rates with rates of habitat shift. And so the kind of simulations that we use, they were informed based on what we know about species-specific dispersal rates. So published dispersal kernels for each species, life history traits like age to maturity, and then it was a 90-meter resolution. For our current range, we use the Climate Change Tree Atlas, which is in green on the map. Hopefully my slide has progressed to that at this point. For the range that the species is migrating into, we used future suitable habitat for the average of 3 GCMs in high emissions scenario based on the Climate Change Tree Atlas. That's in yellow. And then the map on the left is kind of a null dispersal. There are no dispersal barriers whatsoever, so cells are free to disperse into the yellow suitable habitat. On the right side, the gray is non-forest land use. And so non-forest land use is, it's based on the National Land Cover database. And so cells are free to disperse past, but not into non-forest land use. And so I'm going to walk you through the results in 25-year intervals for our dispersal simulation. So first is 25 years later, and so this is the null on the left, and then dispersal with a land use on the right. And so by the end of 100 years, the end of the simulation, hopefully you see that now. The null dispersal on the left got about 50 kilometers from the current range. Considering that most oak species take 20 to 25 years to reach maturity under ideal conditions, this shouldn't really be that much of a surprise. You know, there really are only 4 new dispersal events for a newly colonized cell within 100 years for southern red oak. I should also note that our null dispersal simulations we use 10 kilometers as our long distance dispersal. And this roughly averaged 1 to 10 kilometers per decade for the 15 species we looked at. Those are similar to the rates of post-glacial migration determined by the pollen record. So, so we feel pretty confident that our simulations are a decent representation of dispersal. It's just not very far on the scale of our lifetimes. The simulation on the right now, including the dispersal barrier of non-forest land use, we can see that there's basically no effective dispersal beyond its current range because of this area of a lot of non-forest land use and just poor forest connectivity. And this area, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but it's basically Northern Virginia, DC area up through central New Jersey was a consistent dispersal barrier in our simulation. So pretty much any species that's range was south of this region was not able to disperse through. So just to kind of summarize what we found, species dispersal rates were slower than species habitat shift, even in our like maximum dispersal simulation. So we did vary our long distance dispersal from 1 kilometer to 10 kilometers for like one possible dispersal event. And even at our maximum, the dispersal rates were slower than habitat shifts. And the habitat shift is based on the climate change tree atlas predictions. Oak species had the slowest dispersal rates, the fastest species habitat shifts, and no species filled the majority of the predicted newly suitable habitat by 2100. We also identified 2 major dispersal barriers. So the one I showed, which is the kind of DC area up through central New Jersey, and then there was an east-west dispersal barrier in central New York that was south of the Adirondacks that affected like white oak, chestnut oak, pignut hickory, and I think it was black gum. Okay, so skipping along to our regional regeneration study, we coined the term regeneration debt, and this is to incorporate the idea that abundance and composition are both important for assessing the regeneration layer. So if you either don't have enough seedlings or what you have in the species that you have of seedlings doesn't match the canopy, you have a regeneration debt. Regeneration debt is not always a bad thing. So if you think of a successional forest that's going from aspen and birch and transitioning to spruce fir, the regeneration debt here just predicts that there will be a change in the future composition of the canopy. It's not necessarily bad. However, when regeneration debt is caused by anthropogenic stressors and you have either not enough regeneration or suboptimal species regenerating, then there's a problem. And I'll show an example of that in a minute. And in addition to quantifying regeneration debt across the region, we also we related the findings to anthropogenic stressors and metrics of climate change to determine the drivers. We used FIA data for this analysis, so didn't use any park data for this. And the map that hopefully is showing now is of seedling density across the kind of eastern US. And so you can see the green means lots of seedlings, the gray means very few. And so you can see there's a lot of regeneration in Maine, northern New Hampshire. Perhaps those were the folks that responded that regeneration isn't a problem. But then there's this area in the black box of very low regeneration. Zooming into that area, so the dark gray in the map represents seedling densities of less than 1 seedling per 10 square meters. And then the lighter gray is less than 1 seedling per 4 square meters. So it's really, really low regeneration. And so next I'm going to walk you through the metrics that best predicted these patterns based on model selection. So invasive plant cover, it was good to see in the poll that a lot of folks are concerned about invasive plants because they are where we find low seedling densities, we also find very high invasive abundance. So here you see in the red, there's a lot of invasive cover in kind of DC, Maryland area, Eastern Pennsylvania. Also, we see a lot of deer browse impacts. It's also important in the model. Unfortunately, so the deer browse index is collected by the Northern Research Station with Forest Service, not Southern Research Station. So we don't have data for Virginia in the FIA data set, but we do with it in parks. But anyway, where there's low seedling seedling densities, there's also high deer browse impacts. And then another important predictor was the percent of human modified land cover. This is at a 300 meter scale or 300 meter resolution. It was also an important predictor of low seedling densities. So next we looked at composition between the regeneration and canopy, and we used similarity metrics, which is plotted on the right map here. So similarity is a measure of species that you have in common between two groups, in this case the seedling versus the canopy strata. We also looked at sapling versus canopy. And so if all the same species are in the seedling layer that are in the canopy layer, then you have a similarity of 1. If you have no species in common, it's a similarity of 0. And so here we can see on the map on the right, where there's low seedling densities, there's also what's there generally is not what's in the canopy. So that's the main takeaway. So not only do we have low seedling abundance, but what is present in those low seedling areas is not what's in the canopy. Looking at what species are driving this low similarity. So in this region, a lot of the canopy is dominated by oak. And so on the right side of this map, these are tree density, relative abundance of trees. And then on the left are the relative abundance of the seedlings. And this is we can see like there's a lot of oak in the canopy, not as much oak throughout that whole area in the understory, and then there's also a lot of beech in the northern part of this region in the regeneration layer, not so much in the canopy. And then invasive tree seedlings and low canopy were the other important predictors for the low similarity. And so invasive tree species like Norway maple, tree of heaven, those were part of the mismatch that we were finding. But then also kind of the strongest driver and maybe the biggest surprise to us was that there are these low canopy species such as Carpinus caroliniana, which is musclewood, Ostraya virginiana, which to me is called ironwood, sassafras, pawpaw, striped maple. These are all species that have like a central stem and a central tree or a tree form and are somewhat browse resistant or unpalatable, and but they're not going to form a tree canopy, and they seem to be dominating the regeneration layer where there's not a lot of regeneration. So then we kind of put all of those metrics together. So looking at seedling and sapling density and then similarity between the seedling, sapling, and canopy layer, and putting that together, we find that there's really severe regeneration debt in this area from northern Virginia kind of up through southern New England. So just to kind of summarize that study, we found severe regeneration debt in mid-Atlantic forests, particularly in oak hickory forests. Anthropogenic stressors predicted the debt better than climate change metrics. I didn't show that, but those are the results of our model selection. This also involves many of the species predicted to gain suitable habitat in the Northeast. So a lot of the species predicted to gain suitable habitat in the Northeast, like these oak hickory species, they're not regenerating well in their current range. And so now putting together the regeneration debt severity and the dispersal barrier, you should hopefully see that they're the same area. Like it's almost exactly mapping of the same area that's causing a problem. Coincidentally, we have a number of parks in this area with forest plots that we've been monitoring for 12 to 15 years. We've surveyed them 3 to 4 times. And so if you're not convinced at how severe these issues are, I'm going to show you what these forests look like based on what we're seeing in our parks. And so first I'll talk about invasive plants. So we have an invasive trend analysis that's in review right now, where we looked at invasive abundance in 39 parks that have been sampled at least 3 times over the last 12 years. It's over 1,400 plots. And we found that invasives are widespread in our region, and they were consistently increasing in abundance across our parks. So 35 out of the 39 parks we looked at had invasives in at least half of their plots. 30 of the parks had at least one significant increase in invasive abundance. We only had 2 parks that showed overall declines, even though like invasive plant management is occurring throughout the entire region in our parks. Those 2 parks, if you're interested, were Marsh Billings Rockefeller in Vermont, and then Prince William Forest Park in Virginia. And the worst invaders were exotic shrubs, so Japanese barberry, Japanese honeysuckle, wineberry, multiflora rose. Those were some of the worst. And then Japanese stiltgrass, Microstegium viminium. So just kind of mapping out the invasive plant abundance in our parks. So I should say, unfortunately, I didn't have time to request data from our Eastern Rivers and Mountains and National Capital Region parks, because I kind of put this together last minute, but the trends hold up in the Pennsylvania, West Virginia parks as well. So where we have in the FIA data really high invasive abundance, we also see that in our parks. So in this region, the kind of Eastern Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Looking at deer browse impacts, this is the same metric that the Forest Service collects. We also have high deer browse impacts in this area from kind of DC up through New Jersey. Saratoga in New York is also kind of an anomaly. There's a lot of agricultural land and edge around Saratoga, so there's pretty high deer impacts. And using the deer browse impacts to determine like the minimum stocking thresholds that McWilliams developed with FIA, we see that we have a number of parks where not a single one of our forest plots has sufficient regeneration based on the stocking index. And so, and it really is following that same area that in the FIA data, we saw very low seedling and sapling densities. So this is definitely a concern in our parks as well. Gettysburg kind of comes out, it looks like a bit of an anomaly based on the patterns we saw with the FIA data. And a big reason why Gettysburg is so highly stocked with regeneration is that they've been managing deer since the mid-90s, I think. And so that's a big reason why they have a lot of regeneration. But as I'll show you in a second, even though they have high regeneration in Gettysburg, unfortunately, the composition of the regeneration is suboptimal. And so that's the next map that I'm showing. So this map is a map of our forest plots in Gettysburg. So each pie is a map, and the size of the pie is relative to total seedling density. So bigger pies have more seedlings, and the colors represent the species making up the seedling layer. And hopefully you notice that there's a lot of brown, which is ash, a lot of pink, which is low canopy species, and a lot of blue, dark blue, that's elm. And so we have a lot of species regenerating in the understory in Gettysburg that just aren't really going to form a continuous canopy long term. Okay, so now for a more extreme case in Morristown. Morristown's experienced widespread regeneration failure for decades because of chronic deer overabundance, and then later invasives facilitated by deer. And we are actually losing small trees in Morristown. So over a 12-year period, we've lost trees in the 10 to 20 and 20 to 30 centimeter size class. Some of it's from emerald ash borer that's taking out trees. Some of it's from more intense storms and Hurricane Sandy. And there's just no recruitment of smaller trees because of regeneration failure. And so this is kind of the end result, which may seem extreme, but we're seeing more and more of these persistent exotic thickets develop. So there are actually 4 people in this picture. When we started monitoring this in 2009, it was closed canopy forest. Then Hurricane Sandy took out a bunch of trees in 2012, and the understory is now an exotic shrub thicket. Similar patterns are now happening under ash as they die back in some of our parks. And so I show this picture to make the point that forests in this region that have high invasive cover and chronically high deer browse pressure, they're really one disturbance away from becoming this. So just to kind of summarize, invasive species and overabundant deer are impacting forest regeneration in parks and throughout the region. Many of the species predicted to gain suitable habitat in the Northeast have regeneration debts in their current range. And then there's also a strong spatial overlap of regeneration debt and dispersal barriers that will likely impact tree migration. If it's not already impacting tree migration, so there's some evidence of northern hardwood and spruce fir species moving north and some evidence of oak hickory species moving west because of increased moisture availability. There's almost no evidence of oak hickory species moving north. And it may just be a lack of climate response, or it may be that they can't migrate through these dispersal and regeneration barriers. And even though most of the issues I documented are south of the region that many of the people on this call probably work in, this affects us too, because the oak hickory species that are predicted to gain suitable habitat in the Northeast are probably not going to make it here on their own. And so, you know, the southern oak hickory forest species, they're not going to save us because they're not going to be able to get here on their own. So I can't end any presentation without some management recommendations. We need to reduce these non-climate stressors that are impacting regeneration. So of course, overabundant deer and invasive plants. I really think this needs to be a regional, issue that we try to tackle at a regional scale. I know it poses enormous challenges considering how many states and jurisdictions and landowners involved, but if we don't do something big, more and more of the eastern forest is going to look like the barberry thickets in Morristown, which is bad for the area it's occurring in, but also is going to affect the ability of trees to migrate. So in addition to that, I think we also need to consider range expansion and assisted migration beyond these dispersal and regeneration barriers that we found so that trees are able to migrate with their suitable habitat. Okay, so that's all I have. My contact information here is here if you have, if you want to know more and if you have any questions. And then we have a ResearchGate project for our Eastern Forest Monitoring Program with parks. And a lot of our recent publications are up there. So that's all I have. I think I can stop sharing my screen and I'm happy to take any questions, or I think we can do that later.
Yeah, thank you so much. We are going to move on. I think Chris can share his screen and we'll continue with the presentation. There are a lot of great questions coming in, and if you don't mind posting your contact info in the chat box, then I think you will definitely get some inquiries from folks, but we'll save the questions until the end. I'm trying to get them a little bit organized. So, Chris, whenever you're ready, we'll have to go ahead. And again, thanks, Kate. There's a lot of good info there. Thank you.
So thanks. That was a great presentation, Kate, and a really good kind of lead in. And additionally, thanks to Amanda and Maria for inviting me to present today. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of a tale of two forests, and talking about two kind of forest restoration projects that we conducted with partners. And then I'm going to explain as well as we kind of go along why kind of forest restoration is or forest regeneration is such a key process to recovery and resilience. And Kate has done a tremendous job kind of setting that up. So first I'm going to start off by kind of providing some kind of background information and kind of tying this into kind of climate adaptation. Then I'll talk about a project that we implemented at our Tug Hill Conservation area where we did do some supplemental tree planting and assisted migration, and share with you the results of that project. Secondly, I want to share with you a project from the Catskill Mountains where we've been working with a partner on forest regeneration and resilience, in which that forest was affected by emerald ash borer, and we've utilized kind of deer exclosures to kind of enable regeneration to get established. And for each of these projects, I'll kind of share the kind of the lessons learned. So just some background information kind of illustrating the importance of regeneration. NIAC and the U.S. Forest Service kind of published just recently a forest climate adaptation and forest carbon management strategies menu and strategy selection. Two primary goals for the Nature Conservancy is improving forest resilience and improving forest carbon stocks and sequestration. And so within that kind of menu of strategy, enhancing forest recovery following disturbance is one of the primary kind of recommended strategies. And there are numerous actions that touch down upon what I'm going to be talking about today. So promoting and revegetating sites promptly after disturbance so they don't turn into vinelands, as Kate described. Restoring disturbed sites with a diversity of species that are adapted to future conditions. And so the Nature Conservancy really came to this forest regeneration issue approximately about 10 years ago. And so I worked with a scientist in the Nature Conservancy and co-authored a report kind of utilizing the similar data to which Kate presented on the status of forest regeneration in New York State. And what we found was about a third of the state, based on that 2008 data, was in a poor or fair kind of status. So not having sufficient regeneration to respond to disturbance and replace the existing forest canopy. And so as you can see, the areas here in orange and red really overlap with the Kate data that Kate just presented. So I just want to also kind of explain some of the factors kind of influencing regeneration. There are numerous and they've already been somewhat discussed. So high to moderate deer browse can certainly have a huge impact. Invasive competing vegetation, light and space is certainly also a significant factor. And then soil moisture and kind of seasonal drought potentially increasing due to climate change is likely to be an issue in the future. And so Jeff Ward in Connecticut really produced a great kind of regeneration handbook that explains a number of these kind of factors. So the two sites that I'm going to be talking about today are kind of shown on this map. On the upper left-hand side, you can see outlined in blue is the Tug Hill Conservation Area. And then in the lower kind of right-hand side is the Catskill Mountain location highlighted in blue. And so these areas are overlaid on a map that was produced by Will McWilliams with the U.S. Forest Service in a general technical report, which I highly recommend. That this map is basically showing the probability of moderate to high browse impact. So the areas kind of in red, based on the FIA field data, have a higher likelihood of high to moderate browse impact. And so what I just wanted to kind of illustrate here is that this really is two kind of stories, in that the Tug Hill kind of restoration project is predicted to have low deer impact, whereas in the Catskill Mountain project, that's kind of one of the kind of driving factors, is the high deer browse. So now kind of talking about my first kind of demonstration project, the Tug Hill Climate Adapted Forest Restoration Project. So just to give you some context, in 2002, the Nature Conservancy purchased 45,000 acres on the Tug Hill Plateau. We retained 15,000 acres, and 30,000 acres was a DEC easement was put on that. And so in 2014, we acquired an additional 400 acres, and that parcel is what I'm going to be talking about today. And so this map here basically depicts that 400 acre new acquisition. And so this area was heavily impacted by a 300 acre commercial clear cut. So it was a fairly intensive disturbance to the forest understory, in which all of the viable kind of valuable trees were removed, and predominantly beech and other kind of non-commercial species were left at the site, which are currently affected by beech bark disease. And so you can see the skid roads and haul roads kind of in lighter color on this map. And so we basically went through a kind of a climate adaptation process, and the project team really identified kind of site vulnerabilities at this location. And so asking the question, was this 300-acre high-graded clear-cut area resilient to kind of climate change? And some of the things that they identified were lack of overstory cover, poor current stocking, poor tree health due to beech bark disease, and significant low abundance and diversity of tree regeneration. And in a lot of cases, we had kind of an herbaceous vegetation or competing vegetation at the site. And also the project team really identified the fact that, climate change was likely to affect the site and through increase in seasonal drought. So to kind of address these challenges, they came up with two primary project goals, and that was to increase the density and diversity of tree regeneration and to establish climate-adapted tree species at the site as well. And this was done through primarily two management actions. The first was to manage competing vegetation, and then also to plant 35,000 bare root tree seedlings across 50 acres. And so you can see the project area highlighted in orange on the map to the right. And then in red are the 30 kind of monitoring plots that I'm going to be talking about in regards to the success of the project. So the project team selected a list of 11 different tree species for the site, and they utilized the climate change tree atlas and data for that to determine which species to plant. And so there was a whole kind of range of species, ranging from species that were present to the site at the site, like sugar maple, and we were just looking to kind of bolster the existing population, as well as species where we were looking to kind of assist the migration of the species. So for instance, kind of red oak. And so this is the distribution map for kind of northern red oak. And you can see the Tug Hill area kind of outlined in blue. And so as I mentioned, we assisted this species in moving. Red oak is not found on the Tug Hill region, but it is found approximately 10 miles away in the Black River Valley. And so we essentially assisted its movement into the Tug Hill for climate adaptation reasons. So as I mentioned, we planted with a contractor 35,000 seedlings in the spring of 2017. You can see that we did some kind of pre-commercial pre-treatments to limit the amount of competing vegetation at the site, and then also use kind of tree tubes as well. Just following the planting that we did in 2017, that spring and summer we went into a pretty extreme drought for about a month that we didn't have any measurable precipitation. And so that significantly impacted the survival of the bare root seedlings at the site. And so this is data that is showing kind of survival 2 years post-planting of the different tree species. So you see survival and then the tree species, and then on the left is the number of samples that we had within our monitoring plots. And then I've also coded each species of whether it was an enrichment planting, so the species was present at the site, we're looking to bolster the existing population, or a population expansion or range expansion, which is coded by PE. And just what I will note is that species such as red oak and white oak that were relatively drought tolerant did quite well and better than a number of the conifers that had a relatively low survival. And so unfortunately, the kind of the average survival across our plots of the seedlings was around 32%. And we think that this is predominantly due to the kind of extreme drought at the site. So kind of the lessons learned, the project cost was approximately $70,000 to plant the 50 acres. And so that was to hire the contractor as well as to purchase the bare root seedlings. The project success is yet to be determined. kind of looking at our specific objectives of increasing regeneration density and then also establishing those climate adapted species. We found that seasonal drought can substantially impact tree seedling survival, and so that was an important factor. And then also that drought tolerant tree species had a greater survival than other conifers. And that we also, in taking a look back, kind of looking at potential best management practices for assisted migration would have been beneficial. So now kind of moving to kind of the second project, kind of the second story that I want to tell. And so this is a project in the Catskill Mountain Forest where emerald ash borer basically killed 30% of the forest overstory, which was white ash. And the current overstory is predominantly remained to be sugar maple, red maple, and with a smaller percentage of oak and white pine. In general, there was a lack of advanced regeneration when the project was evaluated in 2014. High deer herbivory, invasive plants were present, such as Japanese stiltgrass, multiflora rose, and bittersweet. And again, climate change was likely to affect these forests through seasonal droughts and other factors. So to kind of address these challenges, we established two goals, again, increase tree seedling and sapling density, and then also the diversity of species to make it more resilient. And so the long term was to kind of restore the canopy cover and increase forest stocking. And so the management actions that we took, we installed deer exclosures, an 8-foot high fence in 2 stands that were approximately 3 acres each in size. And our invasive species team removed from all of 4 rows and kind of barberry for those areas. And then additionally, I just wanted to mention, you know, this landscape is also hunted through a recreational hunting program. And in some instances, deer management assistant program permits were required to take more doe from the area. So just in general, the results that we kind of found, here's some photos from kind of the 3rd year after the fence went up. Inside the exclosure, the density of seedlings was significantly higher. So you can see here just a thicket of black birch intermixed with tulip poplar and red oak that were kind of towering over the field staff's kind of heads at between 10 and 15 feet tall. Whereas on the right, outside the exclosure, those species were present, such as black birch, but at a much, much higher, lower density. And so these graphs here basically show that same story. There were 2 stands shown in blue and red, are as the site called Plank Road, and then in purple and green is a site called Sand Hill. And so just in looking at seedling density greater than a meter tall, you can see that within the exclosure, the blue line, there's a significantly higher density of seedlings in that kind of height class inside the exclosure. However, we didn't see that trend at Sand Hill. However, we are thinking within, this is the 5th year after the exclosure went up, that we'll see that change. And when we take a look at tree seedling richness and sapling richness and diversity, these are some photos from the 3rd and then also this summer's field season where we just collected the data. Inside the exclosure on the left, we have tulip poplars that are already 2 meters tall, so up to 6 to 8 feet tall, sassafras, oak seedlings that are reaching, you know, 1 meter to 2 meters tall. Where on outside the exclosure, these seedlings are currently present, but they're so heavily browsed that they're not making it and being recruited into the taller height classes. So for instance, here you have a tulip poplar that's been browsed multiple times and is questionable whether it'll survive, a white pine that's been hit fairly hard. And we also have these areas that are affected by hay-scented fern and also stiltgrass, with relatively low kind of diversity. And this trend can also be seen within just the 3-year data. We think that this trend will become even more pronounced. So at the Plank Road exclosure, just a significantly higher average richness of species that are shown by the blue bar, as well as when we look at a diversity index, a higher kind of diversity within there of the exclosures. So the kind of the lessons learned from this project are basically the project cost was $9,000 for each of the exclosures. There is fence maintenance required each year. The fence needs to be monitored, and our partner organization has had to do maintenance on the fence just about every year. However, the results are really promising. Density is much higher, as well as kind of the diversity of species. Certainly, these results are very similar to other deer exclosure kind of studies or demonstration projects. And so, but I guess the question is this scalable, and how this might be deployed across the landscape, and what goals could it achieve? A note that it seems as if recreational hunting had limited effectiveness when we compared those results outside the exclosure to inside the exclosure. But I do wonder, is kind of small exclosures possibly a method or strategy to maintain diversity in refugia across the landscape as we look at our forest in regards of changing climate? And then potentially kind of probing the question, which potentially Kate answered, does high deer browse really limit our ability to adapt over time? So when we look at a species like tulip poplar that's doing so well inside the exclosure, it's on its northern range, but it's basically not present outside the exclosure in the surrounding landscape. So with that, I'll just kind of thank the partners in the project, as well as the Wildlife Conservation Society that provided the funding. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Yeah, Chris, actually, if you don't mind leaving that last slide up, that would probably be a little more pleasant to look at than the than just the regular backdrop.
Okay.
But yeah, thank you both for your presentations. So we have a number of questions that have come in. I'm going to start with some questions that came in for Kate. And Kate, I think you're going to get some follow-up. I think you're going to get some follow-up correspondence from folks. One quick one. Ted asks, why the low seedling density along the West Virginia border in the Appalachians?
I don't know. That's like part of the area I don't actually work in. Does anyone on this call know? I mean, I assume it's similar issues that we're seeing where I actually work with deer and invasives, but I really don't know.
Okay, thanks. I know, yeah, these are all going to be tough questions, I think. Let's see. We had a question about canopy mismatch with regen. Mila asked, how about pine canopy with red oak regeneration? This is a common occurrence, and the stand of the two mixed is often expected. Is that a mismatch?
Yeah, I mean, based on, you know, the metric that we were using, it's a mismatch. It's not necessarily bad, like I said. Like, it's kind of the regeneration that we're using is really just to try to identify areas that might be problematic. Some of those areas that come up with the regeneration that aren't necessarily problematic. But yeah, it's basically if your similarity measure is low, there's a regeneration debt. And then you have to look further to figure out if it's a problem or not.
Got it, thanks. Well, another one for Kate. Is the poor regeneration similarity with overstory canopy, can that be explained by light use requirements? For example, a species X in the overstory would use a specific wavelength of light, hence the reproduction of that species would not be expected to be abundant because the overstory species use much of the particular wavelength of light that the reproduction also needs.
So not something that I looked at, but I think the key here again is that a large part of the oak hickory forest that I think a lot of managers are concerned about that are working in those areas, oak is not what is regenerating in the understory. There's kind of this mesification thing happening that a lot of people are concerned about, and so that's more what I was looking at is, you know, what might be driving that mismatch.
Got it, thanks. I think we'll give Chris some hard questions to give Kate a little bit of a break. So one of the questions, actually, we were talking about it during our test run. So Chris, have you looked into using splash walls, research from the Arnott at Cornell, to exclude deer? If so, what are the challenges here?
Yeah, that's a great question, Amanda. So that's a relatively new kind of management practice. And so what we've thought about is how potentially we could scale that practice down and potentially even be applied across different types of kind of forest ownerships. And so it's one thing that I've been thinking about is trying to get a better understanding of kind of what is working across the landscape by surveying different forest managers and landowners to find out what there's working and what's cost effective.
Yeah, and I'll mention that we're working on trying to bring that practice over to Southern New England, again, dealing with some of that oak regeneration debt. So we'll see where things go, but very good question. We had a comment from John Scanlon. He says he encouraged state fish and wildlife agencies to coordinate with state agricultural agencies to tie bow hunting for deer to the locavore movement, where people set a goal to obtain X% of their food from within 10 to 20 miles of where they live. This supports local agriculture and reduces the carbon cost of food transportation. The climate impacts of processed meat tends to be high, so replace some of that with local venison from within 10 to 20 miles of where people live. So yeah, John, thanks for that. And if you have any venison recipes you want to share in the chat box, that's also welcome. Good thought. Let's see. I'll give Chris another question. This is about Tug Hill. So Brian asked, from a silvicultural term, we wanted a clarification about high grading versus clear cut, because those are two different terms silviculturally. So to clarify that, Amanda asked, in the Tug Hill project, did you remove the poor quality trees left after the high grade prior to planting?
We didn't. We did. So as a commercial, what I kind of defined as kind of a commercial clear cut. And so we basically treated, there wasn't much residual stocking left, but we basically treated the competing vegetation utilizing brush saws and then a couple of other different kind of methodologies, such as a brush mower.
Okay, thanks. Chris, you had another question about Tug Hill. And was there any sampling for J rooting or L rooting of seedlings after planting? J and L rooting can also lead to greater mortality from drought.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so trying to evaluate kind of quality assurance of the planting, they planted this site, surprising it was a large commercial tree planting crew, and they planted all 35,000 seedlings in 2 days. And so we did not monitor for that. Subsequently, we did a project this year in which we did go back and kind of monitor the quality of the planting. So that could definitely be a factor.
Great, thanks. Fred also wanted to point out, just so you know, in a joint project in Fairfield, Connecticut, Aquarium Water, TNC, and DEEP have employed the small exposure refugia system on sites with Superstorm Sandy storm damage. That is quite a tongue twister. So in Connecticut, some of that is going on. Let's see, I can pitch another question back to Kate from earlier. Neela had asked, in hardwood forests, I have seen places where one white ash tree is responsible for a very high regen density for a big reach beyond it. The ash trees are not common in the forest, and yet it seems to be the predominant species in regen. How can we explain that as anything but regen debt?
I agree. Yeah. I guess I'm not quite sure what the question is. I mean, yeah, we have a lot of ash regeneration in a number of our parks, more ash regeneration than we have relative to the canopy. They just produce a lot of seeds, and they seem to be able to, I think they're able to like grow through a lot of browse pressure. And so we just see like these ash seedlings that are probably like 30 years old that are like 15 centimeters tall, and every year they get nipped. And I think, so that's part of it, is that they're just persisting over time. And just knowing with emerald ash borer at this point, it's not something that's going to really make it into the canopy unless something big changes. So, so yeah, like that's a big part of the regeneration that we're finding, and that's a concern. So.
Well, thanks. And speaking of ash, just again, a quick plug for our next webinar in the summer series on managing ash and climate change in the context of that little green bug. Let's see, Kate, you had another question. It was, are the worst invaders, quote, equally inhibiting regeneration? I think that was while you were talking about invasives.
Yeah. I think what we're finding is it's especially the exotic shrubs that are really, really inhibiting. I think there's some work in the National Capital Region, actually in Catoctin, that kind of found that Japanese stiltgrass, at least, like might actually be able to protect seedlings a little bit once they get taller than the stiltgrass. Maybe not so much, but yeah, the invasive shrubs, once they take over, they really can choke out just about any regeneration, besides like tree of heaven, which is not, a species that we're really interested in.
Yeah, nobody's interested in tree of heaven. Let's see. So the next question was actually on management in national parks. Brian asked, given National Park Service concerns, are any silvicultural practices being used to resolve regeneration issues?
So not yet completely. So Gettysburg actually did do some what they called forest health cuts. They were trying to make the forest a little more open for regeneration, but also to kind of look more like what it was, during its kind of important history or period in history. But kind of what we found through our monitoring is yes, there was more regeneration, but also the invasives went crazy. And so we're being very kind of cautious about suggesting any kind of thinning in the canopy unless there's funding kind of long term to manage the invasives before, during, and then the long time after any kind of thinning happens. And that is something that, especially for the oak hickory forests in the southern part of the region that I work in, we may be thinking about that as a tool over time, but not without invasive management at the same time. So.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, the invasives management is certainly a critical piece everywhere. Let's see. I guess a question for either of you. Neela asked, are there any good reasons to set land aside as no cut in terms of regen debt permanently?
I don't know if it's necessarily a reason, but I guess I just will point out that like natural canopy dynamics and other disturbances have promoted, a variety of age classes and structure over time. And so those structures have developed and regeneration has occurred based on single tree mortality, and then also disturbances such as Kate mentioned, like Hurricane Sandy. It's these underlying kind of stressors that really prevent those natural processes from taking place, such as deer and invasive plants.
Yeah, and I'll make a case for protecting more lands. I think that that's my wheelhouse is land protection, and I guess probably Chris's too. So I have to support that idea. And something that we found in our forest monitoring is that comparing the structure and stand level tree diversity in our parks to that surrounding, like forests surrounding our parks, is even like our historic parks that are small and they were set aside for something entirely not related to forests. Our forests and our parks have higher structural diversity, larger or higher density of larger trees than surrounding forests, and they also have higher stand level tree diversity. So that's kind of a reason for protecting more forests, but they also have problems, as you've seen. They have the same invasive and deer problems that the region has.
Thanks. We had a couple of state-specific questions for Kate, and folks on the webinar, this is your last chance to type questions into the chat box. So take advantage of it while we have both awesome speakers here. So Amanda Freitas asked, is Rhode Island extrapolated from eastern Massachusetts? Wondering how to interpret deer browse intensity there and what to make of the no invasive seedlings.
So I'm pretty sure there were FIA plots in Rhode Island that came from. So the maps that I showed were actually like kernel smooth maps based on the FIA data. The analysis I did was actually on the plots themselves. I just kind of mapped it out so that the trends are a little easier to see. So I'm pretty sure there was data coming from Rhode Island that informed that. Maybe not as much as Massachusetts, but yeah.
Well, thanks for clarifying. And we had a question, can you refer to New Hampshire regeneration stockings?
Yeah, so at least with the FIA data, the northern half of New Hampshire had high seedling densities, and it seemed to have the similarity was also high, if I remember. So similar canopy and understory composition, which matches what we see in our parks there.
Well, thank you. So let's see, we have we had quite a lot of good questions that came into the chat box. I think I've tackled most of them that had come in. So maybe in the last minute or two, I'll ask each of you. I know when we were setting up for this webinar, then we were looking for some hopeful notes to talk about. So can either of you or both of you share any positive or optimistic notes as we're talking about regeneration debt?
Kate, do you want to go first? Or?
Sure, that's like the hardest question I think I've gotten today. You know, I think the hopeful part of this is that I don't feel like it's been hard to convince people there's a problem. I think most people already recognize it, and it's just a matter of figuring out how to deal with it. And I've been impressed with the kind of resourcefulness and thinking out of the box that the managers that I work with are willing to consider. We still need money to actually pull it off. But I mean, even the idea of like assisted migration or range expansion 10 years ago when I started this job was like super taboo in the Park Service. And now it's like, you know, it's part of the things that we're considering. So that, I guess that would be my positive. I feel like we have what we need to move forward. We just need to start doing it.
Good answer. We have a lot of doers out here on the webinar as well. So Chris, what are your thoughts?
So I'll say that I think, you know, I'm not sure how yet with deer kind of being one of the predominant, I think, drivers of some of these trends that kind of we're seeing. I'm not sure yet what to feel, you know, or what to think about, you know, possibly changes in deer management policies. It seems like there are some initial kind of, you know, movement on how deer are being managed within the Northeast, but the progress seems to be extremely slow. And it's unclear at this point whether or not recreational hunting can solve some of the problems that we currently have in regards to high deer herds. I guess I am hopeful and optimistic that it's possible that family forest owners might see incentives and other programs that potentially to utilize some forest management techniques in ways that could promote forest regeneration, as well as agencies. So as Kate mentioned, the problem becomes more socialized and people recognize this as an issue. I'm hopeful that, you know, agencies and then family forest landowners, as well as industry, will be trying to employ practices that will increase diversity and abundance of regeneration.
Great, thank you. All right, so just as a reminder, I don't see any fresh questions coming in the chat box. So as a reminder, we will post a recording of this webinar along with the resources that were referenced during the presentation on the website. Thank you everybody so much for joining. I did put a link to the SAS CEU certificate in the chat window, and if you missed it for some reason, feel free to email me and I can send that to you. Please join me in a huge virtual thank you for our two presenters. That was a fantastic job and so much information to share in a brief hour. So huge thanks to both of you, and thanks to everybody for joining us, and thanks for your great questions. It certainly kept everybody on our toes.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks for inviting me.